What were the foundational philosophy and ideas that led up to the classical economists in the 19th century? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy and has for many years. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. How's it going, Richard?
It's going very well, and it's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Keep in mind that we've got our next presenter in our Austrian economics series. Not yet Richard. Richard's still coming up, but we got the great Pete Boettke. And we've had some great presentations. If y'all have already watched them or you tuned in live, which is really the preference, you notice that these have been a really enjoyable experience. That was what we wanted to do with these things, is to make it a fun intellectual event, not just some dry academic type talk that you would use to fall asleep at night. But the personal type aspect. How did you destroy? How did you discover Austrian economics? What is the impact it's had on your life? Tell a little bit of the personal stories that are involved here, and then some of the principles. And here's the educational part: the principles, the books, the presenters that really have you felt have been played a big role in your intellectual development. And the first presentations have all been just absolutely fantastic. We've had three, and now we got the great Pete Boettke. And of course, Richard knows Pete. I know Pete, star Austrian economist there at George Mason University. I think he was teaching at NYU for several years under Israel Kirzner there, Richard, if I'm not mistaken. And Pete is just an absolutely great presenter, one of the popular instructors there at George Mason. I know you're going to absolutely enjoy Pete's talk. And yeah, you can wait till we post it the following week, the recording of it. But if you can make these things live, it's a lot more fun. There's a Q&A session after them. You get to participate in those. And so I hope you'll join us this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. this week, Eastern time. If you haven't gotten a Zoom link, then go ahead and go to our homepage, scroll down to upcoming events, click on the conference, click on the conference page, and then you'll get the registration, fill it out, you'll get the Zoom link. And then you just click on that at about 6:55 p.m. on Thursday. So, Richard, I thought we would discuss something that we've never discussed here. Let's go back into more of an academic setting here. And that is the subject of what we often hear in economics called the classical economists. It's a term that's often used, but I thought, well, let's discuss this subject. And I'm going to, obviously toss the ball to you because you're the economist. But I remember when I got to Dallas in the 1980s from Laredo, where I'd been practicing law, and I moved to Dallas to start my own law practice. I found an Austrian economics professor there at the University of Dallas named Sam Bostaff. He was head of the department. And I had some free time, and of course, my passion was Austrian economics and libertarianism. So I sought out Sam, and I made an appointment with him, and I said, I would like a personal tutorial in Austrian economics, and I will pay you. And so we negotiated a fee, and so we would meet every week for about, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours. I guess it was maybe a 2-hour session where we would discuss Austrian economics. But he said, let me see your reading list. What have you read? And I'd been an economics major in college, and then I'd gone to law school. And so I showed him my list of books that I'd read, and he says, okay, this is what I want to do. Let's go back to foundational principles. Let's start with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and then we'll work our way up through the classical economists and then on to the Austrian economists. So I said, that's fine. And so we did a chapter by chapter analysis of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and then we started moving to the classical economists. We didn't cover all of them, but we covered John Stuart Mill and David Ricardo's principles. And what I was doing, some of this was complex stuff, for me at least. And so what I was doing is going to the SMU library and looking up history of economic thought books to try to get a grasp before my tutorial with Sam each week of what John Stuart Mill stood for, what David Ricardo stood for, and so forth. And of course, the biggest thing for me was the labor theory of value, or the cost of production theory of value, and how that related to what Adam Smith had done. But why don't you start out by giving us an overall perspective of what the classical school is all about? Who were these classical economists? What is their import in the history of economic thought?
Well, in general, it can be said that before the 18th century, particularly the second half of the 1700s, it would be difficult to say that there was even a field called economics. Now, in the 19th century, what we call economics was called political economy. So in many ways, those terms are used interchangeably in that earlier period. The presumption is that government was needed to control, regulate, plan, restrict, guide. And that was the system that had existed from the 1600s and the 1700s, known as mercantilism. It was basically the 18th century version of the centrally planned economy. If people were left alone, they would import too much, or they would export too much, or they would produce the wrong goods, or there was no assurance that the products needed for the betterment and the sustenance of the population would be created. Government had to have a guiding and directing and commanding hand to assure that both the domestic economy and the international impacts of it redounded to the benefit both of the people, but most importantly, the king. The king was viewed as owning the nation state. He owned the property, he owned the livestock, he owned the people in a sense. And his concern for the betterment and the wealth of the people was as a means to the end of his own wealth, and therefore his responsibility to maintain the autonomy, the independence, the greatness and the growth of his nation state. And then in the second half of the 1700s, first in France and then in Great Britain, there emerged this different way of looking at things. There was first the physiocrats in France. The leading figures were Francois Quinet, who had been a personal physician among a staff of physicians to the King of France. He got to know the King of France very well, tried to explain economic ideas to him, with no effect, by the way, for the most part. Another one was a man named Turgot, who had been a governor, a prefect as they call it, but basically a governor of a French province, and decided to apply these new market-oriented, free enterprise-oriented ideas at a provincial level with great success. He ended up being appointed basically what would be considered a finance minister of France as a whole. And he didn't last very long because he tried to break the interests of the privileged, the powerful, the nobility, the church, in the defense of the ordinary man with economic freedom. And that backfired. All the special interests ganged up on him, and he was forced out by the king of removing him. But what these French economists, these physiocrats, argued is that there is a natural order to the social and economic system. Maybe I should put it this way. Francois Quinet, being a medical doctor, had obviously was an expert in the physiology, the chemistry, the biology of the human entity. And he noticed that there was a division of labor, that there's the lungs, there's the bloodstream, there's the circulatory system, there's the nervous system, there's the brain, and so on. And they all work in an interactive way. And whenever there seems to be some part of the body slightly out of whack, other parts of the body readjust and adapt. For example, if it's too hot out, your body perspires to lower your body temperature, and that's that type of thing. Well, he said, you could look at the society, and there are different parts to the social body. There's agriculture, there's industry and crafts, there are merchants, there is the government, the king, there is the church, and there's a way to see how they're all interdependent. Agriculture grows food. but they need implements and tools and things that cannot be grown on the farm. So out of the surpluses of agriculture, there's the ability to sustain people in towns and villages, who are the merchants, the traders, the crafts and manufacturers, and they make the tools that enable the farmer to be productive. And the better the tools, the more productive the farmer becomes. The more productive the farmer becomes, the greater the surplus is above what people in the farming community need themselves to sustain themselves. Therefore, a greater surplus to sustain more people in manufacturing and craftsmanship, which improves the tools that people have to do their farming. So a vicious cycle of prosperity, if you will, virtuous cycle of prosperity. And the state didn't need to do anything. In fact, Quinet and then Turgot hammered away that when government intervenes, when government controls, when government restricts, when government prohibits, when government commands, in fact, it's preventing the spontaneous interactions of the people in the marketplace that occurs through supply and demand and prices. Simultaneous with this, in Great Britain, and not exclusively, but particularly in Scotland, a particular and strange historical fact, there emerged this parallel ideas with what were called the Scottish moral philosophers, of which the two leading ones, for our purposes in economics, were David Hume and Adam Smith. David Hume is well known as a philosopher, as an historian, as a political writer, but in fact, he was a very prominent and widely respected, what we would call an economist today. In his writings, he basically showed government doesn't have to regulate and control international trade, that there's a natural adjustment between demands and supplies and prices to assure that there's a balance between imports and exports. The government shouldn't manage it. The government doesn't have to regulate it. The government has to assure a coordination between the domestic economy and international affairs, precisely because the market does it itself. He developed what became known as the specie flow mechanism, and basically says that, well, let us suppose that the government decides to print up a bunch of money to cover its expenses, but there's a gold standard. Well, as prices rise because of the paper money expansion in Britain, things appear less expensive to import from France. So, but you can't spend the paper money. You have to use an international commodity like gold. So gold is withdrawn from the banks. It passes through as British demand for French exports. The gold passes to France. The goods come to Britain. And as gold leaves England, that brings downward pressure on prices in England. But as the gold is traded away into France, the gold makes prices in France rise. So again, through French prices starting to rise and British prices coming down through the export of gold, given the initial attraction of French goods versus domestic British goods, the balance is brought in. And he basically said, if the prices act as the incentives and the movement of goods and commodities, including gold, act as the mechanisms through, the economy brings this natural balance. So we don't need the government to do this. And the government's presumption that if another country gains by trade, that your own country must lose was wrong. All countries gain from the benefits of trade through specialization and division of labor. And in his famous essay of the jealousy of trade, he begins it with the quote, "Not just as a man, but as an Englishman, I pray for the prosperity of Italy, of Spain, of Germany, even France itself," right? The great enemy, even France itself, because the more prosperous your potential trading partners are, the more they could be producing that would benefit you, and the greater your markets to be able to export things that will enable you to buy all these improvements that their goods can give you. David Hume was a Scotsman who was a close friend of another Scotsman, Adam Smith. Adam Smith's famous book is The Wealth of Nations, published on March 5th, 1776, a few months before the American Declaration of Independence. And Smith extends this much wider than this, in the sense that he says the market as a whole is not just imports and exports, which he also talks about in the same way, but it's the whole market itself. If a system operates with natural liberty, and what is natural liberty? Government is limited to protection of life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. And it does so through courts of law, domestic police, and a military to ward off foreign aggressors. But beyond this, the government doesn't need to do very much. When there's a division of labor and law assures that people cannot be killed or robbed or defrauded, then the only way individuals can acquire what others have that they might desire is by offering those who have the preferred goods something in exchange that will be taken in trade for what you want. Therefore, as he says, each individual in his own self-interest now has to apply himself in the division of labor to improve the circumstances of his fellows as the means through trade to acquire the things to better his own life. And he goes through a whole analysis, which of course would be much more for us to do, in which he says, as if guided by an invisible hand, individuals pursuing their self-interest advance the common good, that is the benefit of all individuals in the society, in ways that are not imagined or even thought of by themselves, but is far superior and is better than any attempt by the government to direct or plan the society. And he just goes through various situations and institutions and circumstances and policies to just show constantly over and over again these fundamental truths that the market is a self-correcting, self-balancing, self-guaranteeing that the needs of the people are met through the incentives of self-interested conduct in a division of labor. He died in 1790. Just as the French Revolution had occurred in 1789, the year before. And within about a year or so after he died, 2 years, wars began to break out between first revolutionary France, the French Revolution of 1789, and then when Napoleon comes to power, first as a leader of the French Revolutionary military, and then he becomes the dictator, and finally he crowns himself emperor. And he ends up fighting all these other countries. And so a war broke out between Britain and a number of other countries on one side, and first revolutionary and then Napoleonic France on the other, for almost a quarter of a century. And during this period, government controls are increased, restrictions are imposed more on imports and exports. Government, both the British government and other governments, resort to paper money inflations to fund their war finances, as Napoleon did in France. So it seems as if, the government is getting bigger and stronger and irresistibly powerful. But while these approximately 25 years are going on, there's an undercurrent of an intellectual revolution, Jacob. And that intellectual revolution is that people are reading David Hume and especially Adam Smith. Obviously, first in Great Britain, but then translations appear in other places. But the result is that by the time Napoleon is fully defeated in 1815, and even though the great powers of Europe are attempting to remake, a world that will fit their preferences and desires, beneath this, particularly in Britain, though not exclusively, there is this undercurrent of asking, why should government have this much power? Government does not have to have this power to regulate and control. Individuals can be left at liberty to manage their own lives with the latitude of making their own choices and decisions and freely interacting with others for mutual benefit. That makes government intervention a hindrance and not a help. And this is an undercurrent. But then in the 1820s and 1830s, especially again in Great Britain, there forms a free trade association called the Anti-Corn Law League.
All right, let me interrupt you there. Before you transcend into that, let me ask you a couple questions. So was there any awareness or interaction between the physiocrats in France and Hume and Adam Smith?
Yes. In fact, Hume and several of the physiocrats corresponded. Smith is an interesting case, Jacob. I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you for making me do a little annotated footnote here, if I may.
I hope it's not too stressful for you to be asked questions like this.
Oh no, my gosh. I need my therapist. Smith had been teaching at the University of Glasgow, Edinburgh, I think. Anyway, so this rich nobleman approached him and said, "Tell you what I'm going to do, Adam. Leave the university. I want you to be a tutor to my son for a few years. And if you're his tutor, and you'd go around traveling around Europe with him for a while, when you get back and finish your tutorials with him, I will give you a lifelong pension until I can arrange a government job for you." Okay, this is true. So Smith leaves the university, gives up his professorship. He'd been teaching for quite a while. And he goes with this young lord and travels around Europe. I think it was like 2.5 years. And he spent about a year of it in Paris. And so, of course, he has to spend the time as a sort of traveling teacher for the young lad. But he had been reading. He had been in correspondence with some, but now he's spending prolonged and intense time with some of these prominent physiocrats. He's absorbing their ideas. He's sharing his own emerging ideas, so that by the time he goes back to Great Britain and then can have this lifelong stipend at this nobleman's expense. Finally, the nobleman gets rid of it. He arranges for Adam Smith to have a position as a customs inspector. I know it's shocking. Mr. Free Trade is a customs inspector, but to err is human, and we're all frail and imperfect. But anyway, so those interactions and his traveling around Europe with his young student enriched, added to, reinforced, ripened a lot of his own understandings that he had been developing of his own. I mean, you can read his lectures from when he was teaching at the university, and he already has all the basic ideas from the 1760s. He has all of these ideas already: division of labor, invisible hand, natural liberty. But his interactions with the physiocrats made him more aware of aspects of it, and a bit of a critic of some of the physiocratic ideas, not the freedom aspects, but the way they sort of constructed their theory. So there was this interaction going on quite a bit. Now, of course, with the war with Napoleon, that type of interaction, constant personalized interaction, became more limited, obviously. But once the war was over, as I said, in 1813, Napoleon is finally defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. These movements arise, especially centered in Great Britain, for free trade. So in the 1820s and 1830s, this free trade movement, this anti-corn law league, was formed. Corn is the British word for wheat, and agriculture had the heaviest of the protectionist barriers against foreign competition, particularly wheat coming into Britain. So that's why it was called the Anti-Corn Law League. So in the 1820s and growing in the 1830s, and inspired heavily by Adam Smith's ideas and other people now following him and articulating the same ideas, finally led to the momentous occurrence of the abolition of virtually all of these protectionist barriers in the mid-1840s by the British Parliament. And Britain, from the middle of the 1840s and certainly till the First World War, a good 65 years, was virtually a free trade society, both domestically and in internal affairs. But that was Adam Smith's influence. So Adam Smith now is inspiring other thinkers. And among the two prominent ones in the early 19th century, who were really considered sort of the epigons of the classical economists, is Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo.
Okay, now let me interrupt you again.
Yes.
We'll start with those two in a minute, but I think it's important to emphasize one of the points you made is that throughout history, people have been acclimated to the notion that government needed to take care of people and regulate economic activity.
Yes.
That this, and Americans, especially today, should be able to relate to this because that's the kind of life that they have and they favor. where the federal government is regulating economic activity, planning economic activity, taking care of people with the welfare state. So this has been the time-honored mentality of the human race, which really goes to show how revolutionary Smith's treatise was, and
Yes.
as well as the physiocrats. I mean, here he was coming, he was essentially rebelling against this established mindset that continues to this day. You had this little beacon of light where he's saying, you know, you don't need government to do this. And if you have government doing this, it's very destructive. You're achieving the exact opposite of what you want to do, and that what you're really doing is creating poverty for people with your efforts to take care of them. But the other thing I wanted you to talk about a little bit about before we go to the classical economists, and it looks like we're going to be running out of time, so I suggest we use next week for part 2 of this session.
Yes, fine.
But give us the significance of Wealth of Nations, because when I was taking that tutorial with Sam, I was learning that this really was the first modern treatise on economics, because it divided up the different subjects that are now treated in economics books. Would you talk a little bit about the significance that Smith's book had in that area?
Yeah, you see the profundity of Smith's book is that David Hume had been writing things, as I tried to point out. Certainly the physiocrats, in their setting, systematic and attempt to influence policy ways, such as Turgot. But there hadn't been sort of tying it all together, both the insights of these others, plus further implications and applications and understandings of them. And that's what Adam Smith does. He begins with a theory of value. He explains why goods trade are what they are. We haven't talked about the labor theory of value yet. That will have to be part of part 2. He's explaining how an international division of labor works as well as a domestic one. He discusses the role of government. He goes through the various consequences, both in his contemporary setting and historical examples of how government policies have come about, the consequences they've had, the negative impacts that have occurred. But having done all this, he was not an optimist, Jacob. At the end of his critique of mercantilism, in that part of the book, he says, it is unlikely that Great Britain will ever see free trade as it would be to see a utopia here. So he doesn't think his ideas are going to matter. And he says for 2 reasons, the prejudices of the public and the power of the interests. What he means by the prejudices of the public is the difficulty that many people have in following the train of logic of the economist as to why these interventions don't work, and how a free market, if left alone, would. Think of the case of minimum wage laws. Many people just don't understand why the economist is against them. But wait a minute, you poor people, low skilled, can barely get by on to stay above water financially. What's wrong with making the businessman pay a fair wage, a living wage, a decent wage? So that, and at the same time, won't that put money in people's pockets, and that'll help make the society better off as a whole? And the economist has to explain a whole series of chains of logic. Well, why do employers hire people? What are they comparing? They're comparing the revenues they think they could earn from making a product and employing someone, and the wage that would have to be paid. And if the employer decides, all things considered, that the value that the worker contributes to his firm is not worth it in terms of the price he thinks he can get for the product that the worker could assist him in manufacturing, he's not going to hire him. And if the government imposes a wage above what the employer thinks that worker's value is worth, he either isn't going to hire him or he'll let him go, and you'll be creating unemployment. And if you want to make workers more valuable, then you have to create the free market opportunities for skills, education, experience. And that basically is leaving people alone to find their own way, guided by their self-interest, with the institutions of profit-making opportunities to foster and cultivate this. Well, a lot of people just find that counterintuitive. And what put just a minute. Just put money into people's pockets, right? Just put money into people's pockets. Well, that's what Smith means by the prejudices of the public. They just don't see the logic of how the economy works. And the important, though, he considers more important, the power of the interests. The power of the interests are all the special interest groups who live off the trough of government spending, government subsidy, government protections, government anti-competitive regulation, government contracts, and so on and so forth. They will fight tooth and nail to prevent any repeal, diminishment, reversal of their privileged position at the expense of either existing or potential competitors or of the consumers in society. In fact, he even says is that a critic of them runs personal risk. In other words, if he makes too powerful and public a case, he might be accosted by the interests trying to shut him up. And that the person who does this is going to be a lone voice. Now, Smith died in 1790, and I would say he never revised that view. He felt that alas, however insightful and truthful and correct he believed that the logic and the workings of a free market might be compared to the government intervention, he was despondent that it would ever be possible to break the spider's web of special interest groups who don't want an open society, and to overcome the prejudices of the public. That is the difficulty of people understanding the logic and the reasoning of how economies work. Now, fortunately, in the 19th century, he was wrong, Jacob, for a whole series of reasons would be interesting for us to talk about as part of our part 2 next time. But Smith himself, and as best as making the strongest argument one can imagine in his own mind he was able to make, he was not optimistic about the achievement of a free society.
All right, and then let me, before we adjourn, because we're about out of time, I want to emphasize that I never recommend that people that are getting into all this start with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. I found it to be a very complex read, very turgid writing. There's contradictions in it. I mean, this is a work where somebody's obviously the first out to shoot and creating the first economics treatise. You have to expect that they're looking through a glass darkly, even as somebody as brilliant as Adam Smith. And so it's a very difficult read. And in fact, I would recommend that somebody, if they wanted to get the overall feel of what Wealth of Nations is all about, get a good history of economics thought book. Mark Skousen recently wrote one he mentioned in his presentation a couple of weeks ago in our Austrian economics series. That would be a good start. And then you can kind of get an overall feel from a commentator of what Smith stood for and the significance of his book as compared to trying to get through the book itself. It's a very difficult read. So, Richard, we're about out of time. So why don't we, since we haven't yet gotten into the classical economists, which was the topic for today's session, but I think providing this background provides a really good foundation for leading into the classical economists. Why don't we save that for part 2 for next week?
Absolutely. And if I can give a plug, the Future Freedom Foundation is very kindly sponsoring my next book, the title of which will be Liberty and the History of Economic Ideas from the Ancients to the Austrians, in which I do in a lengthy chapter what Jacob just said a reader may find useful, and that is a summary understanding of what Adam Smith and these other pre- and classical economists were all about.
Okay, and we're looking forward to that book as well. So thank you for thank you. Yeah, why don't you just stop teaching there and write our book, Richard? Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Again, remember this Thursday night, Pete Boettke going to be talking about how Austrian economics impact his life, how he discovered it. You'll really enjoy Pete Boettke, I guarantee you. And if you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily and to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, where Richard writes a monthly article. And thanks for tuning in, Richard. I look forward to talking to you next week for part 2 of the Classical Economists.
Until next time.